Hello, G.I. Joe fans. It is time for another episode of Friday Night Frights. Are you scared yet? You should be. For what I am about to tell are true stories. If you don't believe me, then tough! Sorry. Split personality and all. This story happened not to me, but to my sister. This took place back in 1982. The house we were living in was haunted. It had everybody on edge. The more sensitive members of the family were more scared than others. In our hallway, there was a cold spot right before my sister's bedroom. My bedroom laid akin to hers, so I had to pass through this cold spot to go to my room. Needless to say, I did not like to go back to my room. When I was alone, I was never alone. I was afraid all of the time in that house. Sometimes I would even be chased out of that house. But my sister had it worse. She had horrid nightmares. That's how bad they were. I had to say horrible twice. She would awake in a sweat, and when she would wake up, the dream was continuing. She would see writing on the walls in bloody letters. For what the message was, I will not ever repeat. She also saw a cat, a black cat, come into her room on its hind legs, dancing. She loved cats, so whatever it was tormenting her, and we didn't own a cat at this time. We lived in that house for over a year. And all that time, my sister was tormented. My parents didn't know what to do. We just suffered through it. This next story happened to me. I was living in Arkansas. The area where I was living had burial graveyards. And the neighborhood was steeped in rich Civil War history. There was a plantation house not far from where I lived. Its property wasn't very big anymore. But the house still stood on its original ground. The house was big and beautiful, everything you would see in a movie of its era. Had large marble pillars, multiple floors. The house was beautiful. I was intrigued by this house. I knocked on the door and a woman answered. And I said, "Please pardon my intrusion, but I'm new to the area. And I am fascinated by history. Would it be okay if I looked around your property? If you're not, I will leave without any problem." She was glad to oblige, Southern manners and all. She invited me into her house. I was startled. Not by her invitation, but by what I saw in the house. In the front was a beautiful parlor, old wood floors made out of long planks, and they would squeak when you walked across them. Large archways, a spiral staircase leading upstairs. It was very narrow. But what startled me when I walked into the house was I saw a slave woman dressed in period clothing standing in the kitchen. She was going about her chores, paid me no mind. I didn't mention anything to this woman. I didn't want her to think I was weird. She invited me upstairs. The staircase was narrow, more narrow than modern staircases. If two people were to be going up the steps and up and down the steps, I should say, in opposite directions, one would have to press themselves against the wall to let the other go by. So I followed behind this woman, and up at the top landing, I saw an indentation in the wall in the shape of a door. I ran my hand across it. It was very cold. I inquired about the indentation. She said, "Oh, we are not sure, but we think it was an old room that they just did not need anymore, so they walled it in." Why would you wall in a room, even if you do not need it? The only time that I could remember in history when rooms were walled in, people were trying to seal in a dark secret or keep something worse out. So again, I paid it no never mind, not wanting to share my findings with her. But an incredibly creepy feeling fell across me. Chills filled my body as we walked into the attic. The reason why I say attic was because it was a smaller room It was still plastered in the old 19th century style. It had a beautiful round window that shone into the room. And she said, when we moved in here, she said, we found a pentagram painted on the floor with candles all around it that were burned down to the nub. She said, we washed it off. And then that's when I felt free to share my findings with her. I said, since you mentioned that, is this house haunted? And she said, oh yes. She said, we see a gentleman walking around here in a long coat with a top hat. Top hats were fashionable in the 19th century. She said he had a mustache that attached to his sideburns. He seems friendly. I said, yes, towards white people. I think he was a plantation owner. And she asked why. I said, when I walked in here, I saw a ghost of a slave woman in the kitchen working. She said, I've never seen her, but I always felt that I wasn't alone in the kitchen. My husband and I recently moved in here. We bought the house cheap. I said, I could see why. So we walked around the house and the other 12 rooms, always hearing knocks and bangs. And I saw that she was getting a little startled. I said, it's an old house. Old houses make noise. And she seemed comforted by that. So we walked back down the steps into the parlor and into a great room. Up on the ceiling were marks from where an old chandelier was. You could tell from the indentations in the ceiling that there were several. She said, I think this was a ballroom of sorts. I said, yes, more of a sitting room where they would entertain guests. And I looked around the house some more and found indentations in the wall from where candle holders were mounted on the walls. Soot marks in some areas that had bled through the paint. I'm sure people have tried painting over it several times. And then she asked me if I wanted to go out back. She said, I have a beautiful flower garden back there. As we stepped out to the back, I was paying attention to the glass on the wall, in the windows. Some of it was modern, others, the glass was a little wavy, so I knew that it was very old. For they didn't know how to make glass in that time to where it was completely transparent. I'm not a glass maker, so don't ask me how. But in the glass on the back door, which was made of heavy oak, I could see a slight image in the window. It was the slave woman. She was looking at me. Deep sunken eyes. We walked into the backyard. And yes, she had a beautiful flower garden. But in the backyard was a huge walnut tree. And I looked at the tree and I said, that tree is very old. I could tell the trunk was immense. She said, yes. She said, somebody had a rope swing in that tree. Look, there are several branches that have rub marks in them. And I looked at her. I dropped my head. I said, maybe one was a rope swing. I said, the others are rope marks, but not from a swing. And her jaw dropped. I said, you got to remember, this was a plantation. And if their slaves didn't listen or were unruly beyond discipline, incorrigible is the word, so they were hung or resold. She started to become sad as the times have changed. Said, I'm glad that your heart is broken by this. Mine is too. Said, it is completely inhuman what went on here. It has left an indelible mark in your property. The wood has absorbed the energy over the years. She asked me if I'd like to see the basement after we walked around the property. It was still fairly big for being in a neighborhood. I would say an acre or two. I was scanning the property for a family plot. People buried family on their land back at that time. If they buried their slaves, they wouldn't leave a marker with their name on it. Oftentimes it was just a stone slab about the size of a brick, just planted into the ground. So they knew where the grave was, as to not step on it or plow over it. There was still some respectability towards the dead back then, and more so now that people are becoming a little more sensitive. People don't stand on graves out of respect. Although I don't see people remove their hats anymore when a hearse drives by. I do, and place it over my heart if I am not driving. As I know that when a person's body is dead, the person itself is not dead. Themselves are not dead, for the spirit lives on. So she takes me into the basement, opens these old cellar doors, two of them that opened in this manner. We walk down an old an old cement step. Beautiful was this step. It had marks in the middle from years and years of people walking down it. It had an old dirt floor, and the walls were made of cobblestone. And I loved the architecture. You could see underneath the old beams that were used to support the foundation of the house, the floors. And you could see modern piping going through an air duct. Kind of spoiled the image for me. And I looked around and I thought, oh, this was an old root cellar. And maybe it was, because it was deep, felt dank and cold. So I started sharing with her some memories that I've had living in Ohio, going down into root cellars, and sharing with her the things that were taught to me about them. And she said, "You are pretty knowledgeable for a young man." I was only 20 at the time. I said, "Thank you, ma'am. I really appreciate that." I said, "If you fail to study history, you were doomed to repeat it." And she agreed. We were walking around the cellar, which covered most of the bottom of the house. And there was a little room that went off to the side. And in this room, she said, "I don't understand what was here." She said, "It feels different from the rest of the area." I said, "Yes, it does." We looked up on the wall, and there were rusty spots up on the wall to where manacles were hung. It was from the bolts that were put into the wall to attach the chains to the manacles. I said, "Ma'am, I think this is where the slaves were punished even more. They were chained to the walls." And she said, "You're really starting to scare me. I'm regretting buying this house." I said, "Ma'am, every place around here has its history. You shouldn't regret buying such a beautiful house." I said, "Are you disturbed by anything, any evil that may have come from the pentagram?" She said, "We don't know yet. We've only been here for 3 days." I said, "Okay." I said, "Talk to your clergyman if there are problems that happen, so he could bless the house for you." So I thanked her for her time. They're taking a few pictures of the property. And I left. When I developed those pictures, I wish I still had them, for they had gotten lost. I had moved several times. And in the pictures, I would see little orbs. And in one picture, saw a man off in the distance holding a rifle. And appeared to be wearing a Civil War cap and a backpack. Couldn't see a face. If technology were different, I would have that picture blown up and image enhanced. But this is still the early 1990s. And it would have been expensive to have that done. Six months later, I went back to visit that woman to share with her the pictures that I found. The house was up for sale. I hope that you enjoy these stories. I like to share them. I would tell you more, but I need to save these stories for future shows. And Halloween is growing closer. I should have saved my scariest ones for that time, but I had to tell them. So sleep tight, my children. Burn a candle by your bed. Been told it keeps the spooks away. But we all know that's not true.